Browsertherapy.com is the homepage that I'm using for this project. And it's pretty simple. All we've got is 4 blog posts. This top one here is what we're going to be doing today. If you're interested in what we did last month, we have these 3 links here. So the bottom link is the companion article that we did for a session similar to this. So this bottom one and the top one are very similar. And the second last one is actually a video that we made for the last session. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Kyle. He's the one in the cyan kind of sepia tone kind of photo. And he's the one, the person behind the scenes kind of helping me out doing the recording and some of the editing. And if you ever get into a lot of live streaming and Zoom sessions and that kind of stuff, I highly recommend you get a Kyle on your team. Doesn't have to be a Kyle, I guess, but some person who can do the stuff that you can't do, which is a lot of stuff in my case. So he's going to be in the background. He might chirp in once in a while. He's going to be taking a look at the chat. I'm very bad at looking at the chat while I'm talking, so please just try and use all caps maybe. And also it doesn't help that Zoom constantly moves the chat right behind you guys. So if I'm ever just kind of like doing this, it's because I am moving windows around. Okay, so let's take this opportunity to catch up. Yes, so we are going to be using CodePen. All of this, one of the requirements of the sessions that we did for the library were that we had to use Chromebooks. So unfortunately, Chromebooks, unless you've ever used them, basically browser only. So it opens up, it's got a browser, all the applications that Google builds and puts onto Chromebooks works in the browser. So we don't have VS Code, we don't have a quote-unquote proper text editor in order to do any of this stuff. So everything we're going to be doing is going to be on CodePen. And we're going to have a lot of starter files. So if you go to this first article up at the top, this is what we're going to be doing today. So I'll just copy this and paste it into the chat for you. Oh, that is the wrong one. This is the right one. And I apologize if I lag whenever I click on a tab or a button. My laptop is a little not the beefiest. So if I ever do that, I apologize for it. And it always happens when my tab is loading. So here's a good moral for you if you're a web developer. Focus on performance to save Tony's poor tiny MacBook Air. Okay, why don't we jump in and let's just get started. This is the agenda that I have for today. CSS toggles with element.classList. Now there's a lot of big terms on here. We're going to try to define them all the way through. But basically what we're going to be going for is this tissue contrast illusion idea. So last month, actually a couple months before this, to kind of give you some background into why we're doing this contrast illusion. Number one, it's fun. It's a healthy reminder when you're doing visual illusions that we're actually more similar than we are different, which is a great thing to think about, especially with everything going on in the world today. And at the beginning of the lockdown, I finished Netflix. I'm waiting for Netflix 2.0. And I got into CuriosityStream, which is a documentary, I guess, Netflix-style service. So I think it was, I can't remember how much it cost me, 24 bucks a year or something like that, US. And I get all these really great documentaries. And one of the documentaries was on visual illusions. And for some reason, this one caught my eye. It's called the Tissue Contrast Illusion. And I built this app to basically replicate what Arthur Shapiro, the host or the narrator of this show, was teaching. And basically, this is the idea. We've got 2 gray circles, equal gray circles, they're completely identical. And if you add a black background on one of them, you seem to find that the one on the left is a little bit darker than the one on the right. And some tricks of the brain here, even though it's still the same gray, it still looks a little bit darker depending on the background, depending on the context that it's in. And it's very slight. You might have to like kind of squint in order to see it. But as soon as you put a semi-transparent image on top of it, it becomes very striking. And this is basically what we worked on last month. We built the, I guess the middle part, the real, like the image part of the illusion. But we didn't do any of this checkbox stuff. So this is actually something that a work in progress that I've built just to kind of play around with it. And what I'd like to do today is talk about CSS toggles, which is how this form, how these boxes are actually affecting or interacting with this page. It's a CSS toggle. And we're going to go step by step all the way through it. And we're going to be basically, I've given you all the code. I've got the final application. We're going to be building this, a very simple version of what I just showed you with the two checkboxes. But it basically has everything that we need so that if we have time at the end of this session, we can take what we've learned today and apply it to this tissue contrast illusion. And basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be clicking on this little button. We're going to make a little toggle that can change something in CSS by changing the class. So what I'm going to be doing is a lot of basically HTML and CSS, some flexbox just to kind of set everything up. And then we're going to dig into the JavaScript. But I am making a couple assumptions here that you do know a little bit of CSS basics. So most of these links here, I link to the MDN. So this is the Mozilla Developer Network, and they're a really great resource for basically learning everything that the front end has to offer. It is a little dry, so a lot of people like going to W3 Schools instead. I like MDN because they build Firefox. So Mozilla is the company that builds Firefox. They help build these standards that we're actually learning, and they have a pretty good track record for keeping this stuff up to date. And what's great about it is that they'll constantly kind of remind you about the prerequisites whenever you're on a particular page. So as you're going down here, this one doesn't have any because it's at the very start. You can see just getting started with the web. It's kind of getting just the first introduction to CSS. And if this is too slow for you, if it's too dry for you, it will give you the terminology to go out and search the net yourself. Go find your video tutorials or any kind of learning games. If you like Free Code Camp, the world is your oyster. You can learn any way that you want. This is your journey. I like starting at the MDN because it's a good introduction into the terminology, which really does help you create what we call domain-specific searches so that you get really high-quality results when you're learning. So CSS basics. A couple other things that we're going to be doing is working with class selectors. This whole tutorial or this whole session is basically how to change the class list of an element using JavaScript. So we'll go a little bit into this stuff. And this is a really nice article that, so these are the links that I've created. This is CSS tricks. Nice little overview of what class selectors do, a little talk about specificity. We're not going to get into any of that type of stuff. When we get into variables later on, we're going to start talking about JavaScript variables, how to make them, how to assign an HTML element as a variable in your JavaScript using the DOM. And well, the DOM is called the Document Object Model. We're going to talk about that as well. And we're also going to be talking about events. So this is all about clicking. So if you don't know anything about JavaScript or the browser, everything is about events in the browser. There's events happening everywhere. And what we can do is we can write a little piece of code, and we have this DOM, the Document Object Model, which is basically an upside-down Christmas tree that the browser builds. It's the browser representation of your website. And it's a whole bunch of boxes, and each box could be a paragraph, it could be some bold text, it could be a header, it could be a footer, tons of different things. And what each of these boxes have is the ability for us to hang code onto them so that when a particular event happens, we get to run that code. And that's what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be hooking on some JavaScript to a button so that whenever it gets clicked, it's going to run that code and change a CSS class. But events, we're not going to get too deep into it because that is a bit of a rabbit hole. I'm going to be mostly showing you the code, and I'm going to be like doing the Vanna White, but I'm not going to get too deep into what a callback function is or any of the other bells and whistles. Remember, we're kind of coming at this from the artistic side of view, the creative side of things, so I'm going to assume that we're more CSS people. If you're not, totally fine. Then you can dive down that rabbit hole if you want to get into events and listeners and all that stuff. But we're using JavaScript in this session as a means to an end. So it's not the end. We're not here to learn JavaScript. We're here to toggle a CSS class. And if we can do it without JavaScript, fine. There is ways of doing it, but JavaScript's actually not too scary in this instance. Ironically, we won't be using a lot of JavaScript. It'll be mostly what we call a DOM API. So something that's not technically JavaScript, it's something that the browser gives us for free. And that's going to be a common pattern today, or a common theme today, is all of the free stuff that the browser hands to us the moment we open up a web page. So now that we've talked about those prerequisites, let me give you just a basic rundown of how I see the evening going. So I've written this out for basically the objective. So we've seen what we want to do today. We just want to kind of toggle this back and forth. It's a transparent div with a purple background every time that you hit the toggle. And we're going to basically spend a lot of the time setting up just the basic HTML and CSS. So basically making this look the way that it looks right now, presentationally. And then we're going to get into the JavaScript. And ironically, if you can see by this outline, there's a lot of there's an adjective 1 and then a 1A, a 1B, a 1C, a 1D. This is all HTML and CSS. And it looks like a lot, but it's actually, we're going to go through it pretty quickly. A lot of it is actually based on stuff that we did last month. So if you have time to go into that video or into that article that we did in June, this will give you a lot of the background into how we can build this HTML and CSS. How we make a circle, how we make a gray circle, and how do we make it center in the middle of the viewport. That's basically what Objective 1 is. And it's going to be a lot of HTML, some CSS, some more CSS, some more CSS, and then depending on where we're at for time, we might go on a break, and then we'll get on to the Objective 2, which is the JavaScript. And like I said before, ironically, this JavaScript, we don't actually need a lot of lines of code. So we've got 2 lines of code here. We've got 2 lines of code here. And this is kind of a red herring. The only difference between this and that is just this 1 line of code. So with 5 lines of code, we can actually hook up our CSS toggle. So when you're thinking about, oh my gosh, we need to learn so much JavaScript for this, it's not really learning a lot of JavaScript. It's copying, pasting a very little amount of JavaScript, but putting a lot of faith into what we're copying, pasting. So I'll walk you guys through each of these commands and what's actually going on behind the scenes when we get to them. But it's not going to, don't get too intimidated by the fact that we're actually going to be doing this whole JavaScript thing if you're not familiar with it. If you are familiar with it, this is actually pretty easy. It's easy squeezy. It's actually to the point where it's built to be this simple because we're now living in the future. So we now have mobile browsers or modern browsers that help us out with this. And then when we get down to it, here's some cleaning up the code where we're going to add some stuff in here. I put it at the end, but I'm going to be putting it into the code earlier on because this makes things pretty, and I don't like things when they're ugly. If we have time, depending on where we're at by the time we get to everything, we're going to try and add these toggles to the article or to the code that we did last month. So this is the article from last month. And it's got the video to the source, to Arthur Shapiro's clip of his documentary that's on CuriosityStream. And as you can see, the structure of this article is very similar to what I've written for you today. A couple of things, I kind of got rid of all the hidey things because I think people got sick of actually clicking all the things. So I just put all the code in the middle of everywhere. And basically what we're going to do if we have time is we're going to have a toggle that will turn this background on and off using this button. We're actually going to turn one of these circles into a button, hopefully if we get to it. And then we're going to turn this button, the one on the left, we're going to make that turn the image on and off. And hopefully we can get to that point. I think we probably will only get to the point where we have one of the buttons working on the split background, and then I'll leave it to you guys to do the rest if you guys want. But we'll see. I'm not sure. We didn't go nearly as fast as I thought we would last month, so we did run out of time. So I'm going to be pretty conservative on this one. And we can close that for now. Okay, so let's get into CodePen. So as you can see, we have this little demo here that actually works. And if you're not familiar with CodePen, it is a sandbox environment so that you can actually build web pages inside a browser. And in order to get to this code, we can click on Open Link in New Tab. So once it says Edit on CodePen, just open that up. And this is the finished version. So this is basically what we're going to be doing today. And I've added in comments so that you can kind of keep track of where we're going in the agenda. So this is going to be Objective 1A. And first, a tour, I guess, of CodePen. If you double click on here, so I'm going to kind of tell you about what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript do. But actually, let's just do that now. So we have the three pillars of the browser. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Most people know that. Anyone who's interested in subject matter like this has probably heard of that. But a lot of people don't understand what those three technologies are responsible for. They each have their own syntax, they have their own rules of operating, and they have their own purposes. So HTML, I've kind of given you guys some cheater code up here, is all about content. So HTML is what the whole point of the page is. So all the text, all the images, all the headers and the footers, anything that we would consume, it could be videos. And that is where we put it into HTML, where we have opening tags and closing tags. And what these tags do is they describe what the content is. That's the whole deal with HTML, is we want to semantically describe what is going on. So here we have two elements that we're creating. One is semantic, one is not. So the div tag, kind of think of it as a paragraph tag. It's a generic block level element. And I just made a judgment call. I could have used, like, for example, an article tag, something that is more semantic, but div is totally fine for our purposes right now. And then the semantic element is the button. So that's what semantics is. Like, div doesn't really stand for anything. It's just kind of it's a tag just for tag's sake. Whereas a button actually has a purpose. When you're using a button, you want to do a particular thing rather than using a paragraph. When you're using a paragraph, you want to put a block of text on a page. When you have a button, you want to probably click on it or something similar to that effect. So that's what HTML does. It provides the content, and it's also the skeleton. It forms the branches in this upside down Christmas tree that is the DOM. So the very root element is going to be the HTML element, and then it's going to branch down into a head and a body. And we're only going to be dealing with the body. So the body is basically everything on the left-hand side here. So that's what CodePen allows us to do, is it gives us a live preview of what we're actually going to be coding, or what we are coding. Then we've got the HTML here that brings in our CSS, it brings in our JavaScript. CodePen is kind of faking it for us. It just has a whole bunch of magic where we just have these 3 panels. And if we double click on one of these panels, it will expand into that area. So we have HTML for content, CSS is for presentation. So this is for everything where you want to make it look pretty, where you want to change the look of something. So I like to call it, like CSS is one of the 3 pillars, but within CSS we have 4 pillars, which I like to say is color, typography, layout, and animation. We'll call it 3.5 pillars. And we're going to be mostly dealing with layout and a little bit of color. We're not going to be doing any animation. We could maybe if we have time, but I don't think we're going to have time. But that's what CSS does. So it kind of is the artsy-fartsy code base if you're going to be a developer. And then down here at the bottom we have our JavaScript. And JavaScript is the behavior. And in practice, that basically means that JavaScript is responsible for anything that HTML and CSS don't do. That is, of course, a generalization, but that's kind of what JavaScript is all about. It's an imperative language. It's all about the how, or how do you want this done? So I want to do this. I want to create a variable. I want to add 1 to this other variable. I want to multiply these 2, and then I want to print the output. CSS and HTML, on the other hand, are not imperative languages where there's a step-by-step process. It's more of like not a how, but it's a what. It's a what's going on. So think of CSS as a big board of switches, and you're just flipping switches, basically. And HTML is giving you those switches. But JavaScript is all about how and when and where we're flipping switches, like the things that can be done so that we don't have to, kind of thing. So this is CodePen in a nutshell. I'm going to start fresh. Well, not really fresh. So if you're in here, so let me paste this. Actually, you guys already have the link. What am I doing? So what you can do, you might be able to see it down at the bottom. There's a little button down here called Fork, way down at the bottom right-hand corner. Now, this is probably only going to be available if you're signed in to CodePen. But if you're not, you can actually just go right to this link. And you should be able to just click on that, and you'll be able to see the code and play with the code if you want. But what I also recommend if you want to code along is to start up your own window. You don't need to have a CodePen account in order to code along. You do need to have a CodePen account and to sign in if you want to save what you've actually created. And that's one of the advantages of CodePen, is the sharing aspect. So we're doing this for fun, we're just doing this for us, but at the end of the day, it would be really nice to be able to share this with somebody and you know, basically get a trophy, a participation trophy from somebody, maybe a hug, if we're allowed to hug. So I'm going to hit Fork. So what Fork does is it basically copies everything that I've made here into a new CodePen so that I can work on it without destroying the original. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete all of this. So we'll just start all over. I'm going to leave the objectives. And I'm just going to start from scratch. I'm just going to live code this. And it might get to the point where I will copy and paste from the article, maybe, but I'll try and live code all of this and explain it as I go. And we don't need that. We'll just get rid of all of that. Okay. Then we hit save. And again, this is on a different one than you guys have. You guys have the original, but feel free to start fresh if you guys want. And what I'm going to do is I have a fancy Pro account, which gives me this professor mode, which kind of cleans up the whole interface, gets rid of all these little bars and stuff, which is quite nice. Okay. So everyone's still good? Any questions? Anyone lost? Awesome, good to hear. I love it when my students are not inquisitive. Okay, so sorry, I just gotta look at my notes to figure out what the heck I'm doing. What am I doing with my life? Okay, so let's start off with these two elements. So the whole idea is that we're going to be changing some things. Actually, let me show you, just based on like the whole point of this is this. So let's go to last month's and I believe I have the final down here. So this is what we did last month. How is the lag? Is my laptop lagging when I'm doing that? It's like a little bit iffy. I've got it on my to-do list to buy a brand new laptop. I am very excited. It's going to be souped up. It's going to be fancy, so I can like stream on YouTube, and I can, you know, put on the kitty ears and get my PayPal account and my Patreon and all that stuff.
Nope, performance is good, Tony.
Yeah? Okay, awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I did reboot, which is, I hardly ever remember to reboot. So this is the end of that first article that we did last month, where we basically built our illusion. Now this is great. We can see it. It is responsive. It kind of flips back and forth when we do this, but it's not interactive. Like if I show this to mom, like, oh yeah, no, these are actually gray circles. They're identical circles. And she'll say, no, they're not identical. One is darker than the other. And I'm like, yeah, mom, but okay. So let me show you this. So we're basically going to do this. We're going to have, like, this is what I built, where I had a toggle that basically would, for example, remove this class. So if I remove this split background class, and if you go into here, we have a little split background, and you don't have to worry about these two because they're overwritten by this one, but this is what that class does, is it adds a linear gradient onto this, which we've kind of played around with it to make it a fancy split background. And we add that to this entire big thing, this main element, by adding a class to it. And if I delete this class, we look over here, it'll refresh and it takes away that background. Okay? And if I undo that, if I put that back, then what it'll do is it'll reload. Now sometimes it doesn't reload when I undo. Here, let me add a... Now it reloads and now it comes back. So this class that I'm adding to the main container is controlling the background on here, similar to how I was clicking it with my checkbox in my demo. Now the image is a little bit tougher. If we get to it, we'll add a little bit of something, something. We'll just kind of go up here and let's say the very top, we can make a class of hidden. And we can do a display none on that. And what display none is basically how you remove an element from the document tree. It just kind of disappears. And we've added that to a hidden class. So what we can do also, and remember, all I'm doing is I'm adding and removing class names from an element. I'm just doing it manually. So I can put hidden on here, and this should reload, and then the image disappears. Similarly, I can do both of them. I can remove the split background image. It'll reload, and we should just have two identical gray circles. Mom, see, I told you, Mom. So this is how we can add that functionality so that when you're showing your friends or your family, oh, this is actually an illusion. We can add this little thing, and it'll add a background. And then we'll remove this image. And we do this while we're digging around in code, talking to your friend, and they totally lost interest. Now, we're going to actually hook some buttons up to this so that it actually does it proper. So that's kind of the whole idea here. And if you ever get lost or completely overwhelmed with the fact that we're using JavaScript or something, this is all we're doing. We're just adding a bunch of names to a class attribute. And if you're not familiar with what the classes are, they're basically a tag cloud for each individual element. Any element can have multiple class names. And this is just a way for us to target them, to find them in our CSS and in our JavaScript. Similarly to how you would tag a YouTube video or something, and you would put in, oh, this is home and garden, oh, this is commentary. You can do that with elements. You just add another class. And there's no limit to how many classes you can have. You just separate them by spaces, and they are added to what we call a class list. And that's the final step that we're going to have today to complete our toggle. But I'm going to close that and not save it, because I always have a habit of saving these stupid things after I break them, and then I have to go and fix them up again. So that's the idea that we're kind of going for here. Now I'm going to go a little bit fast through the HTML and CSS stuff, mainly because we got a lot of stuff to go through, and also because we covered it last month. So if you do want to kind of get more of how we're actually making this circle, then you can go through that video, and we talked about it in depth, basically how to make a circle. But we do have the elements. That's the first step. Content is usually the first step here. And I will close this one as well. So let's just step through these one at a time. So we're on objective 1. So we're going to create and position button circle using Flexbox. We've already added that, or I just haven't deleted it. And we go to objective 1b, which is basically making a circle so that it looks like this purple one. Because right now we have a kind of an ugly toggle and a non-existent circle. And that circle is there, and we learned this last month, because divs are block level elements that they span by default 100% of their container. They go from end to end, and they're only as high as their content. So if it's empty, it has no height. So it doesn't actually exist. So we can't actually see it here. But what we can do, we can go up here, objective 1b, make our empty div look like a gray circle. And I've used a class here of circle, so I'm going to use that to target this element. And with class selectors, you use a dot to signify classes. And we're going to give this a background of, oh, actually, we're going to give it a border. So we want to make it visible. And we're going to make it a gray border. And now you can kind of see the deviousness of block level elements, is that it's got no height. So it's impossibly thin. The only thing giving it thickness right now is 2 pixels of border on here. So in order to change that, what we can do is we can add a width and a height. So these are all box model declarations. So we're going to take a look at what the box model looks like in a sec. And I'm going to go 35 vmin. And if you don't know what that is, I don't blame you. These are viewport units. And we did talk about those last week. And we're also going to do 35 vmin for our height. There we go. So now we got a nice square, a box. And that is one of the secrets of the browser, is that everything in the browser is a box. But we can fake it and make it look like a circle by using border radius. And 50% means that it's basically using the halfway point as the radius. So if we did, for example, 25% here, you could see how the border radius works. Is it basically takes the width as if it was the radius of a circle and it bends the corner around that circle. And this is just one of the oldest tricks in the book to make a circle, is you use border radius of 50%. Which is awesome. And now we got this really ugly, gross toggle. And I'm going to just cheat. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of this. Way down, down, down. And I'm just going to copy and paste this thing verboten. And this is where I'm going to put it under this, this section here of side code. It really has nothing to do with the tutorial or the session itself. It just makes things look better for me. So, there we go. And it's even still kind of ugly, but it's good enough for now. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm just adding a little bit of padding. So if we inspect this, this is your number one thing that you should always do when you're developing, is getting used to inspecting your element. So I'm going to inspect this element. And where did it? There we go. So here, let's move this to a better situation. Okay, so what I did is I right-clicked and I inspected, and the inspector, we covered this last month. I'm only going to talk to you about it just a little bit. Like we covered mostly the inspector itself. So if we inspect this element, it'll actually highlight it in the code here. And what we can do under layout is take a look at what the box model looks like. And if we want to take a look at what we've done to this button, we've got a little bit of padding, half a rem, so I'm not going to get into that, but it's basically half of a line height plus a full line height. This is going to be on the top and bottom, so this is going to be 8 pixels here, 8 pixels on the bottom, 16 pixels on the side, 16 pixels on the other side. So padding is always going to be the space between the border and the content, and then margin is the space from the border to the next element. And that's all we're doing here, is we're just kind of puffing this up, making it a little bit bigger. And we've got a little bit of a border radius on here just to kind of round the corners a bit. So just a lot like what we just did with our circle, but obviously less extreme. We've increased the font size a bit. We've added a barely minimal, some system fonts that don't look quite as ugly as Arial and Helvetica. And this is my personal favorite. I love doing a little font variant, small caps. It always makes any button look a little bit better, no matter what font you use. And the cursor pointer, this is actually just to make that little hand that you normally see when you mouse over a link. Buttons by default don't do that. Not sure why. I found a link on Stack Overflow that somebody wrote an essay about the history of the button element, and there's a reason why we don't have that, but I'm not going to cover it here. Okay, so I just totally cheated. We'll cheat a little bit more because the whole purpose of the day is not the CSS. It is the JavaScript. So objective 1C, so now we got to center this thing. And technically we don't have to do this. We don't have to actually put this in the center. But I like doing that just because we do want this thing aesthetic. We might as well make it look pretty now and make it look balanced. It's barely like what we're calling pretty. But I'm going to just basically freehand this one. And what we need for this is Flexbox. And actually, we did cover this last month. So I'm going to actually I'm going to cheat. I'm going to copy and paste this, and I'm just going to kind of point out what we're doing. So this little bit of code does this little bit of magic. Just kind of throws it into the middle. And this is kind of the tricky part of it, is that I'm using the body tag. So in this context, in the CodePen context, the body tag is this white area. So this is the viewport within CodePen. So I'm giving it a height of 100 VH, which means viewport height units. So it's basically 100% of the viewport, and the viewport being this big white area. And then I use display flex. And if you're not familiar with flex, it's amazing. Please, please, please get into it. If you're doing any kind of professional development, Flexbox is kind of the way that you do it nowadays. And what I'm doing now is basically making it go in an up and down direction. So if I comment this bit of code here, this is the default behavior of Flexbox. It runs in the row direction. So it's going to have basically use this for Flexbox navigation, for like primary navigation, for cards, for galleries, that kind of thing. Anything that kind of goes in a left-right fashion. But we can control that, and we can make it work in a column format. So when I uncomment that, now it's going in an up-down direction. So it starts at the top and then goes down to the bottom. And then what basically this does is justify content, centers it in one axis, in this case the up and down, and the align items also centers it in the left-right. And these are kind of tricky when you're learning Flexbox. Just know that when you change the direction, you also change what justifying and align means. So this is the default orientation where it's in a row. And this is how you remember. Justify is all about justifying content in the left-right. So that means that right now, justify center is centering it in the left-right. And align is in the other direction. So it's in the up-down. So where I'm centering now in the up-down. But as soon as I change the direction, those axes flip. So you got to watch out for that. So if you're in the column direction, your justify is now in the up and down, and your align is in the left-right. And that's a little tricky kind of thing about Flex, but it's definitely worth it to learn because this used to be really hard, centering something in the center of the viewport. You know, 10 years ago, it was not trivial. We'd probably have to use some kind of absolute positioning or negative margins or some crazy stuff. But luckily, Flexbox came out in around 2012 and kind of helped us out with that. So now we got a wonderful little circle here. And we do have to add one little bit of CSS now, is this last little bit. So this is kind of like that split background. This is what we're going to be toggling. So we're going to be adding this fancy background to our circle. So I'm going to put that right here. And we're just going to call it fancy. It's super fancy. And I'm going to give it a background color of Rebecca Purple. My favorite shade of purple, by the way. And so basically we can actually fake this now. We can go in. I can go to this class, and I can put in class of fancy. And it refreshes, and it's now purple. I remove this class, and it is now back to being transparent. And that's basically what we're going to be doing with the JavaScript. We're just going to be doing it so that when we click on this button, it'll add the class to this element and make it purple. And I don't want to, understate how awesome that is, or overstate how awesome that is. Like this is going to be a really nice little trick that you can do for almost anything. Once you learn how to do classes, notice that JavaScript won't care what we put into the CSS. We can make the class any name, we can add it to any element, and we can put the declarations inside that class any way that we want. So you can make things spin, you can make a move, you can do all sorts of things. But we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're just going to keep toggle this background so it's fancy, and then it's not fancy. Okay, I think that this is a good time for a break. We're just going to get into the JavaScript now, and I think this is a perfect time for it. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, and we come back at 5 after 7. We'll kind of blast through this a little bit. If you guys have any questions on any of this stuff, feel free to talk to me. and just spout them out when we get back. Maybe write them down during the break so that you don't forget them. And we're going to see if we can get through all of this and then maybe play around with the contrast illusion that we did last month. Now, is there any questions before we take a quick breather? Alex, yeah, go ahead.
Hey there. I've never seen that V-min before. Do you have a quick Coles notes on what that actually is?
On what is?
The V-min in your
V-min, yes.
in your circle CSS.
Here, let me. Actually, here, why don't I actually post last month's article because there's some links about that in there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, but of course I copy and pasted my local host on there. Ugh. How embarrassing. Here, let me do it this way. So if you're ever on the web page, it's just this bottom link. Mind you, I am redesigning this thing in the next couple weeks. Okay, so that article is from last month, and if you scroll down, we do have a link here for viewport units. And even farther down, when we get to the viewport units, there is a, where is it? I didn't add it. No, here it is. So Jen Simmons here, she's got a really great video called Designing for a Viewport. And she also has another video called Introduction to Viewport Units. And basically what viewport units is a kind of like height or kind of like a percentage unit where it's 50%, 100% kind of thing, only it's relative to the viewport itself. And the idea for that is to create like hero sections so that we can know that there's going to be a big like image when the page first loads and it stops right at the bottom of the viewport. That's kind of what the idea is behind that. In practice, it's a lot. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's really all we're doing right now. Is the V-min? I use 35 V-min, so it's going to be using 35% of the minimum dimension out of the viewport. So in this case, it's landscape, so it's going to be 35% of the height. So that's why this thing is so gigantic. So this is actually taking up 35% of this dimension, and then if it gets smaller this way, now it's 35% of this dimension. So that's basically what viewport units are. So if you click through that article, it's got a lot of the backgrounder for that. So JavaScript. I do have some links up at the top here, basically under the planning it out section. And this will give you some of the background info of what we're going to be playing with. So we just kind of covered Flexbox very, very briefly. This is a link to the complete guide to Flexbox if you wanted to get deeper into Flex. It is well worth your time. And what we're going to do, we're on to step number 2. So 1 sure took a long time. Last month it was the image that took a long time. This one should be fairly straightforward, but I'm going to do a lot of explaining as I go. We're going to be talking about the element.querySelector method. So this is kind of a way that we can import DOM elements into our JavaScript so that we can do work on them. I'm going to be laying right now because it's now loading 3 3 tabs already, and I've got my internet connection is unstable warning already. So luckily everything is fine now. So these are basically what we're going to be playing with is an introduction to CSS events. But what we got right now is basically, I think it links to the wrong one. Let's go to this one, JavaScript variables. So this page will kind of give you the lowdown of what we're what we're trying to do. Is that we want to create a variable inside JavaScript that contains the element that is our button. Now, to give you a little bit of background, I kind of talked about this at the beginning about the document object model. I have this fictitious browser elf that I have in my imagination when I'm doing front-end development. I call him Dobby, and I named him after the house elf from Harry Potter. I call him my browser elf. And he's the one who's kind of behind the scenes, kind of keeping track of every web page that I'm building, every page that I go to, any of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that is required to actually run a page. Dobby's behind the scenes actually keeping track of all that. And what the DOM is, what the document object model is, that upside down tree is basically Dobby's attempt to keep track of where he stores everything. So, you know, when you go to IKEA or you go to Canadian Tire and you go straight for the storage section, you look at all the wonderful bins and all these little things that have little drawers that slide in and out. That's what the DOM is. The DOM is basically this upside down tree that allows Dobby to keep track of all the information he needs to keep track of. And what we can do is we can take a look at this DOM from our web developer tools. So yesterday we talked a lot about the inspector. So let's right click and inspect this element. Am I sharing the right screen? Are you guys seeing my cursor and all that? Sometimes
Yep.
I have a bad habit of keeping it on my timer screen. Okay, good. Whew, I'm on the ball today, for once. So last month we talked a lot about the inspector. So the inspector has a bunch of panels. It can get a little overwhelming at times. You have all of your HTML here, and when you hover over things, you can see the elements inside the viewport highlight when you're doing this. So this is one of the advantages of the inspector. Over here we have the styles, the declarations that we have applied to this. So right now we're inspecting this div with a class of circle, and we've applied 4 properties to it, where we've given it a gray border, given it a width and a height, and we made it round. And then in this panel, we have the layout where we can take a look at the box model. We can see all of our settings. Very, very key to kind of go to your inspector when you're troubleshooting different things. If you've got a bug, you're not sure why something is operating, because CSS does have this really nasty habit of not working ever when you want it to. So you got to take a look at the box model to troubleshoot little things, make sure things are running the way they're supposed to. We also have computed. We talked a little bit about that last month. And we have changes, fonts, and animations. We don't really care about that. What we want is this console right over here. And this might be in a different position for you guys because it remembers where you move the tabs. So I always have my console as the first one. And basically the console is how you can talk to Dobby. So I can clear this right now just to get a nice fresh slate. And any valid JavaScript will work inside the console. So I can do, for example, a 1 + 2 = 3. So I can do basic arithmetic. I can do comparisons. So is 1 less than 2? True. Is 1 greater than 2? False. And you can do a bunch of this kind of stuff. Now, the thing about the DOM, though, or just the browser in general, is you get a lot of stuff for free. You can have a completely empty page with no JavaScript on it, but as soon as you open up the console, you have certain things available to you. One of the simplest ones, and one of the ones that I love, is you can do inner height. So if I click inner height on here, this is the height of the viewport right now. So it is 609 pixels from here all the way up to the top here. And similarly, we have inner width, which is 1760 pixels from this edge all the way to this edge. And the browser makes that for free. Like it just calculates whatever the width of the viewport is, creates these variables for us when the page loads, and they're now available inside our JavaScript if we wanted to use them. But that's not what we want. We want to get our HTML elements into our JavaScript. So we have this button, and we want to add an event listener to it. I can maybe type in button. And I get an error because I have no variable defined for my button. Now what I can do is I can basically create it inside the console if I wanted to. So let's clear that. And the way that we create variables is we generally use an assignment keyword. And I'm only going to use one keyword. There's three that you probably need to know about. There's the const keyword, there's the let keyword, and then there's the var keyword. And I want you to use those in that order. So basically start with const. And we don't have to get too deep into it, but this is how you declare your variables. And const is probably the best one to use. And then if you get into an error that says something can't be reassigned, then use let. But for our purposes, const is just fine. So I could do const. So what I'm doing is I'm using this keyword to tell JavaScript or to tell Dobby that I would like a new variable named button. And I want that button to equal this button element up here, like as it stands in the DOM in memory. And one of the other things that we get for free is the document object. And you deal with a lot of documents or a lot of objects in JavaScript. And we use dot notation to get into and out of different objects. So this is one of the parent objects that you get with the browser, the document object. And inside it are a whole bunch of really nice little nice to haves. For example, query selector. So what this method does is it will go out and it will accept any CSS selector. So any kind of selector that you could use in CSS, you can do a type selector, you can do group selectors, you can do frag selectors, ID, pseudo, tons. Anything that works in CSS will work as an argument for this method. So if I wanted to, I can just put two single quotes. I can do a type selector. And what I'm doing is I'm selecting this element by type. So if I wanted to, instead, do this div, I could actually do it as a class selector, like that. And that would return the div. So you can kind of put anything you want in there as long as it's valid CSS. It will return the first one it finds. So let's do this button. I'm just going to go by the type selector. And I could just hit enter. And that undefined doesn't mean anything. It just means that something happened, but it wasn't an expression. Expressions return values. Whenever you see an undefined, it means it's not an expression, it's a statement. And if you're into JavaScript, maybe that's interesting to you, maybe it's not. But now that I have that button, I can now enter it. And where we got an error before, we now get our element. So, and this, just so that we have a little bit more to work with. And it looks like it just kind of returns the HTML. So we have a button with a class, a footer button, invisible button. Oh, that's not our button, is it? I don't think this is our button, but it might be. This is the trick with CodePen, is that sometimes you don't know which button you're actually selecting, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. As you expand this, you get to see the scope of what the DOM is. Everything in this list is another object that you can access with the dot notation. So you can do button dot node type, and it will return 1, whatever node type is. I've never seen it. Most of these things I don't even know or used or have used. There's a lot of them. And you can go down, down, down. And if you're really feeling frisky, you can go into the prototype, which is all the default stuff that comes with a lot of different elements. And then you can go into that prototype. And there's prototypes within prototypes. And it's neither here nor there. You don't really need to know what each of these things are. You just kind of need to know that there's a lot to offer here. And we're only interested in 2 of these things. So what we care about is our class name right here and class list. And we'll be using that shortly later on. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to do what we just did in the console, created a button variable. And we're actually going to do this in our JavaScript. So we are on objective 2 right now. And I'm just going to type that exact same series of statements. We want a const, and we have a button. And Dobby, I want you to go out, and I want you to find the nearest button. And Dobby will go, okay, here's the next button. What do you want me to do with it? I want you to put it into a variable called button. So now this is going to be the keyword that we access all of these fancy, fancy things. And while we're here, we might as well make one for our circle as well, because we are going to be changing the class of the circle, so we do need to bring this into JavaScript memory as well. So we're going to do circle equals document.query selector. And for this one, because we're going to do a class selector, we start that with a dot, and we do circle. So this first line of code is Dobby going out and grabbing this button. And the second line of code here is Dobby going out and finding this div because it has a class of circle. And then once we have this, what we can do is we can log it to the console and actually take a look at what this button actually looks like. And once we do that, we can now open up our inspector again. And what we have way down here, let's see if we can clear this and actually get our button again. So now that we do have that JavaScript in here, I can still do button again, if I could spell it. So this is the one that we just created. No, it's not, because we're in CodePen. Stupid, stupid. Okay, let's hit save, and then we're going to refresh, and hopefully we get the right button. This is the downside to CodePen. CodePen never breaks on you or doesn't do things the way you want it to do. It's probably because you're trying to do JavaScript inside CodePen, because it's kind of like a browser inside a browser, and some weird things happen. So I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to refresh on this. And hopefully we errors, whatever.
May I interject there, Tony?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was playing around with this during the break, and it looks like there's an actual console inside of CodePen to kind of sidestep that issue, just like right here about.
Yeah, there is, but I don't like it because it refreshes constantly, and it's just really clunky, I found. But you know what? Why don't we give it a shot? So what he's talking about is down here at the bottom. If you can see at the bottom of my screen, there's this little console button on here, and it brings up the console. But notice that it also only gives me the text. What I want to do is I want to be able to actually inspect the object. So that's the one reason why I don't like this console that CodePen gives me, because I can't click that little arrow and look at all the little goodies inside it. So I'm going to close this up, and I'm going to open up the console again. And I'm just going to ignore these ugly errors that pop up. There's a lot of errors. And we're going to open up this button. So this is the button that we've got. We're just going to scroll. And the one that I want to show you guys is class name. So what class name is, this is the location that the DOM or the browser stores that list of class names. So anytime that I add a class name to this, let's turn off the result here and let's go back into our CSS or our HTML. And I'll see if I can increase the font size for you guys. We can actually see this live update as we go. So notice it says class name and it's empty. That's because we have no classes. But what I can do, I can do my class and it should update. And this should update down here, unless it doesn't want to. And it doesn't want to. So disappointing.
Just type button again on the console, maybe.
No, I won't do that. It's one of those little things. There's one thing that we can do here. Let's see if this works. So this is actually like a common problem with CodePen. And what they've given us is this debug mode. And this is available to you even without a pro account. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up in a new tab. What that does is it basically opens it up so that it's not inside an iframe and it's not like a browser within a browser. So now hopefully I can inspect this element. I can go to the console, click button, and it's going to be empty still. Go all the way up. So it still has class name of empty. But if I go to the inspector and I add a class in here, class equals button. I hit enter. Fingers crossed, I go back to the console. And it still doesn't do it. Yeah, let's do another button. Okay, so now it has class of button down here. I can open that up, scroll down, and now it's in the class name of button. So this is where this is actually stored. So if I do more, go to button, and let's say it is also got my class, and let's say it's also gray, hit enter, we go back to the console, and I can refresh it again, open it up, and now it's got the class name of button, my class, and gray. So now we know that we've actually got an actual variable in here, and we can also do the circle, because we've also defined that in our JavaScript. We can open that up. And now we can see that it's got a class name of circle. And what we're going to be doing in a second here is we're going to be using ClassList, the one right above it. So class name is a read-only value or a read-only property where you can only read it, you can't change it. ClassList is an API that they've given us where we can actually change that class list. So if we go in here, we can actually see this as a simple list. Only has one item in it, starts at 0. But if we go to the button, which we had multiples of, we can go to class list, and we see a list of button, my class, and gray. So class list is basically just taking all the class names that you put into your class attribute, separates them by spaces, and then puts them in the list for you. And what class list also gives you are these methods for adding, removing, and toggling these classes. So this allows you to change what class you attach to an element. And it's one of the recommended ways that you basically create a system where you alter your CSS with JavaScript. Separation concerns and a bunch of other nerdy topics kind of come into play with this. Well, that's what we've done so far is we've created our handy dandy variables here of button and circle. And we'll log both of these, why not, as we go. We'll console.log our circle. Okay, we hit save, and I believe if I go here and I hit refresh, we've lost our extra classes that I added inside the inspector, but it is a live view now of what we've got. So we got our console log of our button, console log of our div. And what we want to do is we want to add an event to this. So we're on objective 3 now. And sometimes it's kind of hard to find, but you can find a lot of these down in the prototype. So we're going to use add event listener. And this is going to be down in the prototype because it's available to almost every element. So that's what prototypes are. It's how we inherit these little suitcases of goodies that comes with every object. And it's not in here. So it might be in the deeper prototype. And you just you can actually click through every prototype here until you find what you're looking for. Sometimes I can find it, sometimes I can't. Most of the time, I'm going to go in here out of morbid curiosity for just to remind myself of how much I actually don't know about browsers. And then there's another prototype. So this is inheriting from all the way down into the deepest core of the browser, of the DOM. And you can just keep on going and open up this one. Oh, now we're getting into the all caps. That means we're really deep into the DOM now. And yeah, we still haven't found it. And we can keep going on lower and lower, but I'm not going to do this. I'm actually just going to type it. So the way that we add a click handler. So a lot of what JavaScript is all about is events. So in the browser, it's all about the DOM. On the back end, if you're using JavaScript on the back end, it's probably Node. And Node also runs with events. It's all built around events, except for on the back end, it's all dealing with disk usage, memory management, handling internet connections, that kind of thing. Whereas on the front end, most of what we're using it for is to manipulate the DOM. So what we want to do is we want to add a listener so that anytime that toggle is clicked, we get to run whatever code that we want. And we can do that now that we have one of our variables here. So we're going to add this to our button. So the button, like we said when I was clicking through there's a lot inside this variable right now because it's an HTML element, it's a DOM element. And we get to it using a dot. And there's this magical method called add event listener. It maybe could be more concise, but what are you going to do? And it takes 2 arguments. First argument is going to be the event. And these are predefined, and there's a link in the article of all the different events that you can attach things to. We're going to use the most popular one, which is click. And the second argument that it takes on is a function. So this function is, if you're not familiar with what the functions are, it's basically a unit of reusable code. So it's just kind of like a little suitcase of code that we can run over and over and over again for repetitive tasks, that kind of thing, so that we don't have copies of code everywhere in our app. So what we're going to do is we're going to define this inline. So each function usually has some parentheses, and then some curly braces. So we're just defining this function right inside this other function. And this is called a callback. And a callback sounds pretty fancy, but all it means is that we're passing a function into another function to be invoked later. And the term invoked is important here. Invoked is when you run that function. And we're just telling Dobby that here's a suitcase of code. Don't run it now. This is like a plot device. We want this thing to kind of pop out when the timing is right. And our timing is going to be right when we click this button. So any code that we put in between these curly braces is going to run every time that our button is clicked. So this is kind of a weird syntax, but you see it in JavaScript all the time, Whenever you see these three characters, curly brace, parentheses, and a semicolon, chances are you're probably dealing with a callback. That means that you're defining a function up here. And it can kind of get a little tricky to recognize the syntax, but you know it as soon as you see the add event listener. You'll see this method used quite a lot. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do objective 4. So objective 4 actually goes into this block of code. So anytime that we click on this button, it's going to run the next line of code that we make. As many lines of code as we want. And I'm going to use this class list. Now, before we do that, I want to try using a couple other things for class list. So there's like a class list of add. So let's go back to our toggle page over here. We're going to inspect the element. And we should still be logging our button and our div. So let's actually take this class list out for a test drive. So we're not going to use the button here. We're going to use the circle, because the circle is what we're adding the class to. So we can put in our circle. We can add dot class list. And this comes free with every HTML element that you put into a variable in JavaScript. And we have a couple of methods that they give us. Number one is add. So if we wanted to add that my-class again, I can do that. We can hit enter. And then I can print out my circle again. And if I go into here, you just see a class name of circle and my class. I can also put in that fancy thing of fancy. Let's add fancy onto this. And this is the tricky one, or not the tricky one, the exciting one. We can do fancy, enter, and look at that. Now it just turns purple. And they also give us remove. So we can remove fancy, now it goes back. And you can see kind of in your imagination the class name variable, or the class name, its value changes based on what we use for our class list. But we're going to be using toggle. So toggle, if you're not familiar with that term, it's toggle switches. So basically the way to think about it is you might have a TV with a remote. Some TVs have an on and an off button. Other ones just have a power button. That power is the toggle. So when you hit a power button, if your TV is on, it turns off. If it's off, it turns on. That's a toggle. So we're just going to be toggling a particular class. So we can do the fancy with toggle. And I sure hope you guys can see this. Let's actually clear this. Give us some room here. So we can do circle class list toggle fancy. And we're just going to keep hitting this over and over again, and we'll just watch it turn purple and clear over and over again. So now it's purple. Now it's clear. Now it's purple. Now it's clear. And we're just doing this in the console, but what we want to do is we want to run this piece of code when the button gets clicked. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to paste it right here inside our event handler. Oh, wait. I didn't want to do that. Won't let me paste. All right, fine. I'll just type it old school. And then we're just going to put in fancy. Boom. Now in theory, every time I click this button, it should just work. And there we go. And if we inspect this, actually let's inspect this one. So I'll hit refresh again. I can go to the inspector and notice that we've got this div class of circle right here. Every time I hit it, it should update. Except it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Why doesn't it do that?
Just refresh the page, Tony, because that's the exported one.
I'm supposed to like CodePen, I'm just so used to it just live refreshing. Sometimes it doesn't do that. Let's do it. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, so take a look at this. It says circle, fancy, hit toggle. Now it's just circle, circle, and fancy. And you can see the CSS popping up in here. If we do the console log, and I open up this, now we'll see if this is actually live updating. So it says circle fancy inside the class name. We hit toggle. Ah, it doesn't live update. That's too bad. But you get the idea. And that's basically our toggle. Very simple, pretty straightforward, but don't get sucked into this false sense of security. Okay, this is really easy, because now that you've actually done this toggle, now you see the real power of it. JavaScript doesn't care what we're attaching to this class. It doesn't care what we name the class. It doesn't care what elements we put the class onto. So we can change any declaration that we want to. We can overwrite just regular CSS, similar to how we were doing it before, just manually adding and removing a class, only now it's done with a button. And this is a very powerful pattern. You'll see this quite often. And if you're kind of wondering why we would ever learn this, if you ever use it in the real world, basically hamburger menus. So anytime that you go to, for example, let's go to CSS tricks. You know, hamburger menus, even if you don't know the name, you get small. Take a look at these up at the top. All of a sudden you get this little hamburger menu when it gets too small. So we've seen that 1,000 times. And of course, when you click it, it'll open up this menu. That is class list for you. That's how they do that. They just add a listener onto this hamburger menu. And when it's toggled, it has an X. When it's not toggled, it has a hamburger. And it displays this menu somehow. Maybe it's opacity, maybe it's display none, maybe it's absolutely positioned outside of the viewport. There's a lot of different ways you could do it. This is the basic mechanic of how hamburger menus operate under the hood, and that is using class list API. So when I'm talking about class list, when I say JavaScript API, it means that it's something that's been given to us. So notice, like, this is all the JavaScript we need. Most of it is comments. So a lot of this, like, this is pure JavaScript. This is something that would work on the back end and on the front end where you're defining a variable. But as soon as you get into this is browser only. You can't do this on Node. You can't do this in the back end. And similarly, there's things in Node that you can't do on the front end because JavaScript is hooked into the environment that it's running in. And these declarations, these methods are not pure JavaScript. They are the DOM. They're part of the browser. It's an API that the browser gives us. So these give us a lot of power without actually needing to understand JavaScript. Now, in my heart of hearts, I do think that you should learn the fundamentals of JavaScript. But if this is all that you're using JavaScript for, just doing a little bit of CSS, adding a couple buttons or two, you can get pretty far by kind of copy and pasting code from a decent resource like MDN and not know exactly what's going on. But it's good enough now that you just know that you're adding an event listener. And you should know eventually, like this is the hardest part, is that knowing that this code isn't run when this JavaScript first loads on the page. It gets saved into a little suitcase and it gets attached to a click handler. This only gets run when that button is clicked. And that button can change whatever class on any element that we want. As long as we can import that in as a variable, we can do that kind of action. We can change declarations on each of our elements using JavaScript. Okay, so we're at quarter two. Any questions on this? I think we got just like 15 minutes. I wouldn't mind digging into that tissue contrast illusion, and we'll at least get to the background part of it because that's easy. Okay, I'll just assume that you're all awestruck.
Yeah, no questions. No questions here,
Okay,
Tony.
awesome.
It's been amazing.
Cool.
Yeah, I just have to run, but thank you so much. That was
Oh, you're welcome, man. It was good to see you, or at least good
as
to see your
usual.
face.
Is
Well,
eye-opening.
I did see that beard. Keep that beard going. That's amazing. You can sweep the sidewalk
Okay.
with that, maybe.
Well, thanks
Okay.
again. Take
See you,
care.
Elias. Okay, so now that we've got this, you do have the final code for this if you guys want it. Let's have some with this. Let's actually get back into our first challenge. Let's see if I have it open. I do not. Okay, so this is last month's one, and we have a link to where we finished off last month. So we have a whole illusion here, and I could probably actually get to both of these. So why don't we do both of these right now? I'm gonna put this all at the top. Oh, actually, before this, I am going to clone it. I'm gonna fork it so that I don't save for all of the work that I hate it when I do that, when I completely destroy something and save it. Okay, so here's a fork. Let's start off with, let's just put a little comment in here. Toggle z with exclamation points. So the first thing is, the first one's pretty easy because we already have a class here that we can use. But we're going to do the first thing is get rid of this image so that we actually know what we're dealing with. So in this pen, I believe I used a class of image, and I'm just going to do, oh no, I'm going to use a class of hidden. The display none. And then I'm going to go to the image, and I'm going to add that to the class, and then boom. So we should actually have like a disappearing image. And then we also have split background. So let's delete that. So this is going to be the start of the page. So it's going to start off with two identical circles. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make each of these buttons toggle the split background, and the other one's going to be toggling the image. And I'm just so that we can keep it straight, I'm going to put in BG toggle, and then I'm going to put in image toggle. And here you see the conspiracy of the browser. Everything is a box, even when it doesn't look like a box. This content doesn't realize it's a circle. It just kind of displays where it's kind of odd, and we don't want it to look like that. So I'm going to change these to buttons. And then what that does, just because of the default browser settings on a button, it just centers everything in the middle. So we got nice little kind of clicky little things here. And this border here, that's the default styling on a button. We could remove that. Maybe we will later. But let's just jump right into it. Let's go straight to our JavaScript. And we're going to create our toggles. So I'm going to start with the background one. So it's going to be a class of circle. And let's add another class of BG toggle. And then we're going to add another class of this one, image toggle. And the reason why we do that is so that we can target it with JavaScript, with our query selector. So we can put them into a variable. So we're going to const, and I'm going to call this BG toggle. And we are going to use our new class that we just created. Then we're going to do the same thing with our image toggle. Actually, let's just do one for now. So we've got our new toggle, but we also need to create a variable for the thing that we're going to be changing. So in this case, it is the main element where we have the split background. So we do need another object for a split background. So let's make that. And I'm just going to call it container for no other reason. And I'm going to be super lazy and paste that in here. And this one is going to be just a type selector. So I'm just going to select the main element. So now we have our two individual portions. So we want to add an event listener onto BG toggle. And it's going to be a click handler. And then we're going to define our callback function. And this is where we're going to use class list on the container. And I think that should do it. So let's make sure. Usually there's a big red exclamation point down here if I screwed this up, but now, here, let's get this into this. So if I click this, there we go, piece of cake. While we're at it, why don't we add it to the other one? So we already kind of set the stage here. We have this hidden here. So if we make another toggle that just toggles hidden, this should show up with the image. So let's do that. Let's keep this hidden by default. And since we're at 753, we're going to go a little bit faster by basically copying and pasting this entire block. Hit paste, only this is going to be our image toggle, being selected using our image toggle class. And instead of our container, we're going to have our image that is basically going to be our class of image. And then we have these to change, so our image toggle and our image. And instead of split BG, we are going to be toggling hidden. All right, so let's see. That still works. Click on that one. There we go. Except for one thing. I'm clicking, and now it's not working. Can anyone have a guess as to why that is not working?
Would it be because the image is in front of the button there?
Yeah, the image is now blocking our button, so we can't click on it, which is kind of a pain in the ass. Totally makes sense though when you think about it. Like you do want to have something. So I'm not clicking on the button, I'm clicking on the image. But there is one little quick thing that we can add here to fix that. So on our image, what is it called? I think it's pointer events. So what you can do, there's this declaration. I actually had to look this up because I worked for hours on this trying to figure out why it wasn't working. And it was because that stupid image was in the way. So you do pointer events as a declaration, and you put none. And it kind of surprises me that this is a CSS declaration and not something you add in JavaScript. But yeah, it totally works. So now you can click. So that image is immune to click events. It throws no click events on it. which can throw some stuff out of whack if we added some more stuff to it. But basically, yeah, now we got both toggles, and now I can go to my mom and tell her that this is an actual illusion. I am not trying to take all of your retirement money, even though I get her retirement money anyway. But yeah, that's it. Basically, the way that I did it is I just put it in a side menu with checkboxes, and that's probably the better way to go, so that you don't have to worry about this image getting in the way of the toggle and stuff. This isn't the most elegant solution, but it works, right? And hopefully you can see the I guess potential of the different things that you can do. Hamburger menus notwithstanding, there's tons of applications for the CSS class list or the element.classList. It was built for exactly this purpose, a way of correctly changing the CSS of an element by changing its class name. And that's it. Basically all I had planned for this evening. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, Tony, I had a question. I asked it in the chat, and Alex got back to me with some answer, but I also wanted to know your idea. Which one would you choose between get element by ID or by tag name or things like that, or the query selector as you did? And why would you choose query selector over get element?
Yeah, so here, let me just make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay, so that is a common question. For those of you who are unaware, there is another method where, let's say that I instead put a main, like an ID on my main. And I called it, let's call it container. No, let's not call it container. We'll call it, just call it main. So what we can do is we can use an ID, and this is an old way of doing it. And old not meaning that you shouldn't do it anymore, just old as in this classic way. This is how we did it for years and years and years, where I would do a const, well back then it would be a var. I would do main equals document get element by ID, and then I put in main. And there's no like the names on here, so I could put Tony in here if I wanted to. Go in here and I can put in Tony, and let's just put in Tony for no other reason. And this does the exact same thing. So if I did a console log of Tony, we should see the main element. Now, the advantage to query selector is that you're not limited by IDs. You can do any kind of CSS selector. You can even do ID selectors by doing it like this. And you do it just like how you would select in CSS with a hash numbers. This will do the same thing as get element by ID. The get element by ID has been around for decades, probably since close to the beginning. Query selector is new as of, I don't even know. It's supported in every browser except for IE, I believe. We can actually look it up if you want. Between the two, the advantage of query selector is you're not limited by IDs, and it also can do IDs. The advantage of get element by ID. So the difference between here is you wouldn't put in that hashtag. Document get element by ID is a little bit faster than query selector. So that's basically the only advantage to it. So if you have a very heavy application, if you're doing something in React or Vue or anything, number one, you wouldn't be doing this because React and Vue kind of do that for you. But if you have a big gargantuan loop or something, you have something that's very processor intensive, you would probably want to use get element by ID. But last time I looked up, everything's pretty accelerated. So query selector, even though it's like a touch slower, I don't think it would really matter in most cases. So I teach query selector. I don't teach get element by ID anymore. That said, that's because my students are beginners, so I don't want to give them two different ways of doing things. And that's a downside to the browsers because we can't throw anything out. We have to keep all of the old stuff so we don't break the old internet. We have a lot of ways to do things, and get element by ID was the old way. And I'm a query selector guy now, but if you really, really care about that little piece of performance, do get element by ID.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I don't think you actually have to do get element by ID anymore. JavaScript can just access all the IDs.
Yeah, they can, but so for example, I can get rid of this, and if we open this up, so let's actually go into, I believe it was this one. No. So let's actually open up our debug view again. And we're going over time. I hope you guys don't mind. I don't have a lot going on. So we go into debug view, and we go in here, and I expect, and I go to the console. If I put in Tony, it says Tony is not defined. Oh, I have to hit save. Okay, so let's pretend that I didn't put in Tony here. I'll hit save. Now I can refresh this one. So when I put in Tony, should come up with a reference error. Tony's not defined. I haven't created that variable. But if I add this ID of Tony, and I hit save, and I go back to this page and I hit refresh, even though I haven't actually explicitly declared this variable, it does come up as main. So just by simply adding an ID onto an element, the browser does attach that variable to the window object, but that's why you don't want to do that. This is one of the big reasons why using IDs is kind of discouraged, even though like React and Vue couldn't do their jobs without using IDs. We don't generally use IDs anymore just to import a variable into JavaScript because of basically variable collisions, like collisions of namespace. So think you're importing somebody else's, like for example, jQuery or some other framework that you're using, or a little widget that tells time or something. And they use a variable that is very easily recognized, like date or time. And they put an ID like that in their code. That is now importing a global variable into your namespace that might conflict with maybe the date keyword that you're using. So it's generally considered best practice, even if you do have that ID, that you do explicitly define your variables, because what this does is this will throw an error if it's been predefined. So if somebody, if I used code inside my website that uses BG toggle as an ID in their HTML, this will throw an error because it already exists. And that's what you want. You want to throw an error in lieu of like actually not having an error, because you don't want to start, for example, adding event listeners onto things when you're not quite sure that this is actually your BG toggle. This might actually belong to other code that you're including in your page. So what you want to do is always explicitly define these and use const so that if code comes after your code, like say you include it at the very bottom of your page, this code is running before that, this will also throw an error because you're using const. So what const means is that you can't reassign that variable later on. So when if somebody else tries to use BG toggle, or if there's an element with an ID of BG toggle, that will throw an error. So yes, you can do that shortcut adding an ID, but it is considered, you know, it's not bad practice. Maybe it is. It's not the best way to do it. I would definitely explicitly name your variables, and that also gives you the opportunity to comment your code to tell other developers or other people looking at your code what that variable does in the first place. Because this implied thing, if I just went to my HTML and added ID Tony, and I just start using that variable willy-nilly in my JavaScript, I haven't described where that variable came from. If a new developer is coming in, doesn't know this little trick about IDs, they're going to be completely confused. They have no frame of reference for what that variable is or where it goes. So explicitly defining it allows you to comment that and actually just be a good internet citizen and create code that's easy to use for somebody else. But yeah, that's the long story of that. It's not pure spec. It's not supposed to be working that way. That basically, I believe, started with Internet Explorer. And because they were so popular at the time, all the other browsers kind of followed suit. So it's just almost like a convention of browser makers. There's no guarantee that future browsers will keep doing that. So that's another risk of that.
Good to know. Thanks, Tony.
Anything else?
And Tony, well, actually, my question was not specifically only about get element by ID, because there are other get element, like get element by tag name or get element by class name. So my question was more generally about, like, we can use query selector and use CSS selectors, or we can say, okay, get element by ID or get element by class name, get element by tag name. And I'm still wondering why they started query. So if get element by whatever is older, why did they come up with the query selector, and what's the preferences here? So
mostly convenience. So they're one of the advantages of query selector is that you have every CSS selector now at your fingertips. You don't have to wait for somebody to come up with a find by attribute selector. It dirties the namespace kind of thing. And so there's two reasons why I would maybe use get element by tag name, for example. Number one, clarity. Like you're telling other developers who are reading your code that, oh yeah, they're talking about the tag name or they're talking about class name. And also performance. The second reason would be that slight bit of performance. It is going to be faster than query selector because query selector has a larger filter, a bigger algorithm that it has to accompany. So there is that small bit. So if you're looping through a bunch of images, for example, and you're query selecting a lot of stuff in there, that could really add up. And then you might want to do it by ID or by class name or one of those other ones. But basically, query selector is the newest because it's the most convenient. Basically, all the more convenient ones are the newer ones. All the old, weird, clunky ones are the older ones. And that's the browser for you. You can't get rid of that stuff. It's always going to be there.
thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was wondering, like, if it would be worth mentioning, like, historically, like, a lot of people also would download, like, huge libraries like jQuery to kind of get that convenience as well.
Yeah.
So you kind of see that a lot where the libraries kind of converge, or like JavaScript picks up what these libraries were doing for you.
Yeah, like when it comes into like the history of the web, it's I'd love to be a historian when it comes to this stuff because jQuery came on board like a decade, 15 years ago before all the browsers were consistent because they all had different engines. They talked about JavaScript in different ways. They performed JavaScript in different ways. And jQuery was basically it came in and leveled the playing field. And it was so good, it became so popular. It's still the most popular framework for JavaScript in the world. And you see all of these new ways of doing things like add event listener and class list and query selector. This was inspired heavily by jQuery. Like it's just a really nice way of selecting elements. If you're familiar with jQuery, it follows this exact same algorithm. And it was so effective and so popular that the standards caught up. So the standards being the material whereas the frameworks are the tool. So the material is like lumber. It's the stuff that doesn't change. The tools are the ones that have a version number on it. So it might become out of date after a while. So there definitely is an advantage of using jQuery, but also you see that jQuery can kind of run out of steam. It can get out of date. And it is beginning to get a little long in the tooth. Or you get people using jQuery less in favor of native JavaScript functionality that was inspired by jQuery. So by no means am I like putting a slight on jQuery. It's freaking amazing. Like what they did was really, really cool. But you can see the kind of like the Cold War aspect of this, where jQuery is really good, really awesome. People loved it. And then all of a sudden the standards caught up. We have all these new methods available to us in JavaScript and all these new CSS selectors and all this other stuff that we can now do natively in HTML, JavaScript, or CSS. So now there's kind of maybe less of a reason for using jQuery, just like there's less of a reason to use Bootstrap, because we now have CSS Grid, we now have Flexbox, we can do grids natively in the spec. And then we get into the kind of world of, for example, let's see, jQuery, Bootstrap, we have the CSS Grid, and then we have Sass. A reason we use preprocessors is because you can use variables, for example. And now we have native CSS variables. And all of this functionality that we got from the spec is coming from these amazing frameworks that we've been using day in and day out. And just one of the downsides to it is as the pure specs begin taking on this functionality, you know, it's now becoming in competition with the frameworks that we know and love. So you could still use jQuery, but I generally stay away from frameworks because in my opinion, as soon as you use a framework that has like a version number on it, you've put an expiry date on your code. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently because frameworks do have a huge, huge purpose in our industry for getting stuff done and not having to do as much coding. But I would much rather do vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because the way that the browser was built and the philosophy of the browser is that anything you write today will be good going into the future. Just like we can't change the way the browser works now, that would break the internet or web pages that were built before it. So we do have that, the lack of shelf life on our code. But as soon as we use Bootstrap 4, then we're constantly looking at our watch, when's Bootstrap 5 coming out? You know, and when is Bootstrap 4 so old that it becomes unusable? So you do have to worry about that. So it's kind of a balance. I live in the world of education and small, like minimal viable products, little tiny projects that generally don't have the complexity that requires a framework. So I'm one of the lucky ones. I get to sit on my high seat, my throne, not my high seat, but well, maybe it's both the same thing. Where I generally don't use frameworks, I stick with vanilla. All right, we're at quarter after. Maybe one last question or two if anyone has any. Otherwise, we will finish up. Okay. Oh, do I have, I hear something.
No, I was going to say, Tony, great session, by the way, and I kind of echo your sentiment about minimal code. There's a lot of talk these days on Google or Amazon will talk about high-performant websites, and the idea is there's just way too much code being put into sites these days that slow it down. So yeah, good philosophy. I definitely echo what you're saying. Yeah, we
call them dependencies in the industry, hey? And dependency chains are like probably the biggest bane of on the industry right now, and people haven't figured that out yet, like how to deal with all these modules that everyone's using, and it's just adding like loads and loads of code and risk on top of your projects. But yeah, I don't know, we'll figure it out.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. For sure. No, great session, Tony. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So I think what we'll do is we'll just finish up and just want to let you guys know that every Saturday, if you're a member of the Discord server, so I know some of you guys are on Discord, so feel free to invite anyone here who wants to join in. And that's the Pixels Discord server. So browser therapy is a separate thing from Pixels. Pixels is just like my fun stuff. And this is kind of like my work stuff. Passion stuff is teaching is my thing. And I don't want to start up 2 Discord servers, so I just kind of hang out in the Pixels Discord server. And what I've done is I've basically put together Saturday office hours from 2 to 4. So every week, I'll be available from 2 to 4 on the Discord server for Q&A, any kind of like mentorship, tutorials. I can help you answer any questions you have on things. I'm mostly front end. I do a lot of back end, PHP, MySQL, Node, and Mongo. All the questions seem to be Python. I don't know Python, but I know how to search the internet, so I can help you find any of those questions. So every Saturday, if you're interested, join the Discord server, and I usually put out an announcement for that stuff. Secondly, the next version of this, part 3, is going to be, I believe, August 20th, so save the date on that. And it's going to be still related to this, only we're going to do some other special things where there's other ways of changing CSS with JavaScript, and that's using CSS variables. So we're going to build a little color slider using a CSS variable where we kind of pull it back and forth and actually changes the color of a circle using the color wheel. And hopefully we'll put that all together and we'll actually finish off some extra functionality that I've wanted to add to this tissue illusion for a while. And then that's it. That's it, all we have scheduled for this pilot project. If you guys have any feedback, anything that you want to submit, any ideas, I do have funding to keep going with this. So EvolveView wants to keep funding me, and this is kind of what I love doing. So I just don't know if I have enough time over the fall, but I'm gonna try. So if you guys have any ideas on what other things that we can do, I do want to kind of keep going with this artistic side of things. Maybe it's visual illusions, maybe it's something else, maybe it's just, you know, some kind of weird drawing thing or animation, who knows. But yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. The last one is going to be on August, and then depending on what feedback I get, we're going to kind of keep rolling on into fall, and hopefully keep these going. So go to browse.com. This is going to be the domain that I'm going to be putting everything in. I'm going to be redesigning this baby, and just click subscribe to join our mailing list. You can also hear about us in the Discord server, so I send announcements there. And at least for this next one, I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing the future ones on Pixels. I'm going to be announcing building an event or a meetup for the third one for the color sliders, and that will probably be August 20th at 6 o'clock, same time, same place, and same kind of format. So you guys subscribe to this link. I will post the video once Kyle and I have kind of polished it up. And if you haven't been to the one yesterday or last month, we do have a video for that goes through the entire thing. It's about 1 hour and 45 minutes, so that you can kind of get caught up on the illusion that inspired this whole thing. And then we'll try and do color sliders next month.